Hey everyone, welcome back to the recap of my round 3 of the Amsterdam Chess Open in the Netherlands. This is round 3 and not round 2 because round 2 I got a bye that night, so they gave me a full point bye, told me to go home, and this is round 3 of the tournament, but really my game 2. In this game I was paired against a certain Elmar Holmes, who does have a backstory in this situation. You see, I know Elmar because the day before, after round 1 of this very tournament, I was asked to lunch by Elmar and his friend Paul. I had lunch with them, very nice gentlemen. We start this game, I have the white pieces, he has black, and I go with the trusty e4 move. My opponent goes e5, to which knight f3 is responded with knight c6. So far so good. Bishop c4, and then we hop in to a gioco piano. I have a lot of experience in this opening, I've played it many times in tournaments, and here we go with c3, which opens up the idea to d4, smashing into that center, or d3. My opponent goes with the fierce developmental knight f6, and then I go with d3. You see, I play d4 most often on chess.com, but that's very easy to prepare against. And my opponent has access to my chess.com database. So I go with d3 very early, and I avoid prep. So all morning I had prepped d3 with a full Anish Giri course on d6, castles, castles, and here rook e1. Rook e1 gives a nice game. After like h6, h3, the bishop goes back and we find something like this. I, however, forgot my prep and I played a4, which is still a very trendy and popular move and a really good move, but it's just not my prep. So a4 threatens b4, the bishop would go back, and then a5 and the bishop is trapped. So black is forced to make some air for the bishop, and then I go with b4, bishop back to a7. And so now I go with rook e1. And the difference now than in my prep is that after knight e7, which is the common move, so that black goes to g6 and then eventually maybe f4, on d4, which was the prep, Anish Giri reveals of the game Aleksinko against Caruana in the 2021 candidates, which went like this. Aleksinko went d4 in this position without the b4 and a4 moves, and after takes, d5 is not possible. If d5, here there's e5, and then takes, and black has to ruin their pawn structure and their kingside safety for just recapturing a pawn, which is terrible. Though in my game, after a6 and then d4 here, after knight g6 and then knight d2, takes, d5, I cannot play e5, because here after takes, black does not have the same kingside castle weakness after queen takes. And then after takes here, my pawn is just isolated. So on d5 here, I had to take. And this is how the game was a little bit worse for me given my prep. So when you follow opening prep in chess, it is really important to follow it to a T. So after knight d5, now I accept a full weakness. I have a isolated pawn on d4, which means my pawn can't be defended by other pawns and it's on an open file. So it's really easy to attack this pawn, which is not very comfortable for me. So now I go queen b3, quick development on the knight, c6, and then knight e4. The idea of knight e4 is, okay, you want to release the bishop, yes, but also I want to kind of play against this bishop on a7. This bishop is a sniper, it's hitting my weak pawn. So I want to go to c5 to not only block this bishop, but have a really terrific knight on c5, and if you trade, I no longer have an isolated pawn with d takes c5, and my pawn structure is amazing. Plus, I open up the diagonal for this bishop, it's amazing things. My opponent goes with bishop to g4, and now I start to doubt myself a little bit because its threats are really worrying. After bishop takes, queen takes, my pawn on d4 is not defended anymore, and bishop takes with an idea on this rook here would be down a pawn severely. And what if I defend this pawn with bishop b2? Well, then there's just bishop takes, queen takes, and now knight takes b4. Although the engine will tell you that it's equal here, after these, logical moves, I don't feel comfortable going into a position or a middle game in which I'm down a pawn and I have an isolated pawn here. I didn't find enough compensation in this line to go through with it, and that explains my inaccuracy or my mistake, which is bishop takes d5. Yes, you are not supposed to trade your Italian light squared bishop here. You're not supposed to do it because it's such a strong bishop. And here I traded off for interesting reasons. So after queen takes, I had planned takes, and now knight c5. Here, knight c5 aims to not only block the bishop as before, but now we're hinting at these two weak pawns on b7 and a6, and actually fixing them. On b6, I take this pawn, and on a5, I would play b5 here, and super strong. And if you take my knight, my pawn structure is amazing. Now, if you don't take my knight, my isolated pawn that was previously bad on d4 is really not that bad. It's covered this time by another isolated pawn that I made in the black pieces, and that gives it security. You can't attack this pawn as easily as before, which I really loved about this idea. Although, there is one concession in this position that we see, and that is I let in bishop takes f3 and g takes. I knew this coming into it. It's the concession of this position that I double isolate my pawns and isolate my h-pawn and just ruin my structure on the king side. This lets in knight h4, which is a very serious move, attacking the pawn. Look, I can't defend, just with any move here. I think I need to come up with rook a3 or else it's pretty cooked. Rook e3 just gives like knight f5, right? And I have to make my rook passive and in turn give up the e file. So I didn't really like this idea. So this is pretty forced, and after rook a8, I play king f1. And the idea of this is that after king takes, and let's say check, my king is centralized. And the king centralization is pretty important in general in this endgame, but then you go into the specifics of this endgame, and this is what I really loved. You see, here black might want to establish a majority on this king side to try to convert and try to promote a pawn. Against that, the best piece to stop pawns is indeed a king. So my king is pretty near the defense of this isle and would just go over to the g file to stop these pawns. On the other hand, if I get a breakthrough on this queen side, which I'm betting on heavily with this knight here, then my king would be able to assist. The best piece to help push pawns is a king or rook, and it would be very close to this queen side. So I'm centralizing my king so that it can help in humanitarian aid however it can possibly. Now rook c8 is played. I really didn't see this move. It's interesting. You're threatening this to win a piece, but not really. You're not really winning a piece because I have knight d3. After this move, actually in the game, there was something that was really interesting that happened that never happened to me in my life. My opponent plays this move, or I played my move and then he said it. He asks me middle of the game. Never happened in my life. He says, Zach, do you want a cup of tea or coffee? For me, it was such a culture shock because in Canada, first of all, it's a very independent country in Canada. You get your own coffee or tea if you need, but also to talk during the game is extremely uncommon, and I was just culture shocked totally. Apparently this is completely normal behavior in the Netherlands. This is my first tournament in the Netherlands, because in club play you always kind of be polite with this. You can imagine what impact that had on me. I was out Canadianed in this moment of the game. And believe it or not, this same question happened the next round that same day by my second Dutch opponent. Yesterday it was a Spanish opponent. I wasn't asked for tea or coffee. So you can see the culture dynamics within the tournament. I thought that was really interesting. Also, I'm psychologically burnt from the request of tea or coffee. I don't know why. I was just there's no way I lose to somebody this nice. Rook c8, and I go for something super ambitious. So obviously I want to move my bishop, but it's not obvious where. If I go bishop f4, I fall for little tricks like knight g2 and I lose the game. On bishop g5, I just knight f5 things, and it's really weird to try to defend this pawn. So I go for bishop e3, defending this pawn preventatively and on purpose giving not one, but two pawns by breaking the connection of my rook on the f3 pawn. And now my opponent goes for knight takes f3. So I had predicted this, or I was laying it out for him. The idea is that I'm just attacking their pawns and betting on this 2-on-1 or 2-on-0 in the future, and really just saying you can lose your time winning my pawns, but your pawns are not fast enough. So after knight takes king here and then knight takes, I go with f3 to try to just mess with this knight. for two reasons. The knight's movement is restricted, and number two, if this pawn were to gallop all the way down the board, it's at one point stopped and blocked by this knight really annoyingly. So just an annoying little move, f3 here. Bishop b8 is played, and now I take on b7. Rook c2 to try to liberate this knight. I go king d3, and here you can't really do anything with the rook. You can't really do rook b2 to try to win this pawn, which would be a clever way to try, because your c-file is super weak, and more than that, your back rank is extremely weak. I'm threatening a fork and a checkmate at the same time. So really hard to parry this. So here my opponent went with rook c4, and now I find the idea of the century. I find a forced 9-move combination that, if played here by black, would be a certain win for white. I was so proud of myself, and I hoped that my opponent would play it because it's such a beautiful trap. Here I played knight c5. It's inaccurate for different reasons, but look at this mechanism here that I came up with. If rook takes b4, I saw this during the game before playing knight c5. Imagine. Pause the video to solve. It's a forced 9-move win. I have knight takes a6, which is fairly obvious. The rook has to stay on the b-file to defend the bishop. It doesn't really matter where, because here I do knight takes bishop, rook takes knight, and then bishop f4, a very nice fork that forces only one defensive move to defend both pieces, and that's rook b2. And now I take this knight to deflect the rook off the b-file and play a5. And suddenly, the black pieces realize that they cannot stop this pawn. They can try with rook b2, a6, rook b8, and just in time rook a8, but this fails to rook b3. And now we see the real problem of this king being back rank checkmated. If you try to defend the back rank checkmate, I simply win at least the rook, and if takes, I just win with the queen. And if you take my pawn, it is checkmate on the board at once. White are completely winning here after rook b3. I had seen all of this from knight c5. The truth is, this is inaccurate because I missed a better move, which is super surprising, and that is b5, sorry. b5 attacks this pawn, but really you can't take as black because of the same kind of idea here, is that there's a super weak back rank, and I'm threatening rook a8. And on something like rook c8, now I have rook a8, and black are experiencing some big difficulties trying to parry with bishop f4 that wins a piece. So this is super hard to defend. Let's say you go rook f8 here, then I have b6, and this is troublesome for the black pieces. Meanwhile, you have no counterplay, which in the game my opponent did really well at producing counterplay. So knight c5 is what I played. My opponent did not take on b4, but took the pawn on f3. I took this second pawn, and now we have a super interesting pawn race. It is the 2 pawns on B and A against the 3 pawns on H, G, and F. Really interesting. Luckily, I have a tempo move here. The bishop needs to move. Defending with the rook here is simply losing because I have knight takes, rook takes, and then a5. And it's the same trap. If you take here, there's a6, and then a7 and rook b3. And if you don't take, I'll go eventually a6, a7, and then once your rook moves out of the b file, this pawn rushes down. It's completely winning. So you can't defend with the rook, and then bishop d6 is played. And now I go with a5. a5 is an inaccuracy because there is a better move here, that is rook a1. First of all, it prevents the counterplay knight e1, which I completely missed in the game, but also it takes off the rook from this pin and allows this pawn to march down. My plan was to hike up this a pawn because this bishop is out of reach from this a pawn, and I thought that this was a super nice plan. The only upsetting thing about a5 and trying to get this pawn in is that this knight can be an obstacle for my own self. a5 here, knight e1, I completely missed this resource, and here I take the bulk of my time remaining, and after this move I am in time trouble, like 7 minutes on the clock. Unlike my other 2 tournaments in which you had bonus time of 40 minutes after 40 moves or 30 minutes after 40 moves, there's no more bonus time. You have 90 minutes plus 30 seconds for the entire game. So here there's 2 options for white. On king d2, I didn't like knight c2, that just attacks everything. And then when I defend my pawn, you can just take, and check me. So instead I opted for king e2. And this is not good because after knight c2, rook b3, h5 is just better for black, and this is what was played. Now, I had anticipated that on knight takes d4, as it looks like it's a free pawn, bishop takes, rook takes. Now this is the fourth pawn grab my opponent does. Here there's knight c5, which is really nice. I'm blocking the bishop and rook presence on this pawn while getting my pawn a paved way to the promotion square. And on takes, it's really hard to defend this. I'm threatening mate, so let's say h5, and then I have c6. And if you try to defend this pawn, I have rook b6, and then this pawn will march forward. And then when you try to stop this pawn, I go c7. So very hard to defend that. And that explains the counterplay h5. Super good move. Also delivering from back rank mating things. So a move with two functions, a defensive move and an attacking move. I call this the everything move in chess. I invented that term actually. I'm proud of that. And so here, let's go on takes, okay? Because it's really important to know that you can't really take this pawn with a knight, because on knight takes, bishop takes, I have a6. And you can't defend this pawn unless you're going out of there with your rook and giving a bishop. So it becomes really tricky as well. After this, if bishop takes, however, I didn't see this, but I thought just knight c5, you can't take the pawn because of mate, and I would have a6, a7. Though, after takes, which didn't happen in the game, I would have bishop takes, rook takes, and then I would have knight c5. And I guarantee that this was winning on the premise that this a-pawn is seriously a troublemaker for the black pieces. And if bishop takes, then I just take, and you can't really play rook c4. I'm threatening mate, so let's say h5, rook check, king out, and then c6. And this pawn is really dangerous. Rook c4 to try to stop it, and then rook b6, and you can't stop both of these pawns. I'll have a6, a7, rook here, and then c7, and white is completely winning. My opponent did not take and played h5 first, which is interesting because there are no back rank checkmates anymore on this king. So I play b5, so that bishop takes is not a possibility anymore, nor is knight takes. And again, knight takes is not really comfortable. He played it though. But better is just like rook a4. And the idea is that you sack your bishop eventually against this pawn, and you'll have like a 4-on-1, and it'll be at least a draw for black. Well, at least a draw. But here takes came to a surprise because I just have takes and then rook takes, and now b6, and my pawn is wailing. Like for sure it's promoting now, and I have at least a draw. If rook a4 to try to take my pawn, and the idea for black is b7, rook takes, b8 check, bishop takes, rook takes check, king moves, and then I would have a draw with white. Here I had prepared rook b5, defending the pawn and actually keeping the pawn for b7, b8 with check, and then coming back to defend the pawn. That was the idea. But here my opponent goes with check, which I didn't see, but again, I didn't think much of it because it really just helps me if anything. This pawn is a serious passed pawn, and by doing check, you're helping my king advance towards it and really just be a defensive piece. If the pawn comes anywhere near queening, I just have king g2 in one move, right? So you have 4 moves to try to queen, and then king g2. d4 is played here, and I really did not know what this was for. Why did black play d4? This pawn is not at all dangerous. There was a plan here that I missed to see in the black position, and this ultimately cost me this part of the game, because here I was just thinking, okay, b7, b8. Like if he doesn't go rook a4, I have b7, b8, and I'm winning because I keep this pawn. If I retain this pawn while queening and winning the bishop, I might have winning chances. So d4, I have 1 minute on my clock. I have to play in like 30 seconds. I'm in desperate time pressure. I just go b7. But here, I missed the idea. On b7, black has rook e4, and the idea was that d4 pushes this pawn and gives this alley, this 5th rank for this rook, to win my pawn at the back end of this combination. So check this, check king here, and there's no way for me to defend the a5 pawn anymore. I completely missed this, and here, because black changes plans and doesn't go for this a5 pawn, here white can retain the a5 pawn and be winning. That's right. For one move in this game, I missed a winning move, a winning position here. White to play and win. and the move is knight c7. And instead of going with this b pawn, which would actually now be self-deprecating, I go with the a pawn going to queen. And it's really hard to defend here and stop my pawn. After rook e5, a6, rook a5, there's just like a7, and I'm winning a rook. So I completely missed this by playing too quickly b7, and after rook e5, I'm pissed because now I'm playing for at most a draw. After I queen here and bishop takes, rook takes check, king here, after I lose this pawn, there's no way I win this. Black, on the other hand, has maybe a win if they play really well and I play badly. So after rook e5, I try to go with rook b6, attacking this bishop and trying to, you know, play the field a little bit, get this bishop off of b8. And black's only move is check on my king, to which I go king g2, and now liberating more squares for that this bishop can defend b8. And now I get with a little bit too much on the details. You see, I'm trying to make the most out of trying to promote this. If I can block this square and make my pawn a queen, I would be winning. But here I go with king f3. I play a little bit too much with the food here and try to go with king e4 to really just mess everything up in the black pieces. Though I miss something very crucial, g5 here, a very nice move. You're defending your bishop, and not only that, now I cannot queen with check with queens because you have call the ambulance, but not for me. Bishop takes b8, check reverso on my king, and after king e4, rook f4 check, king back is kind of forced, and then you save your bishop, and this is completely winning for the black pieces. So after g5, I have to play king e4 anyways, get my king out of the discovered check here. Rook takes a5, and now I'm forced to play this. And now we get to an endgame where I have a knight against 4 pawns. It's completely drawn. The next 5 moves of the engine for the next 5 moves is completely drawn. But I have 1 minute on the clock. My opponent has like 3 if my memory serves. So what do? I have to defend this. So here I have a really good start in this endgame. I choose to take with the knight so that my rook cuts off this king here. If the king cannot help these pawns, I am delighted and I have more chances of making these pawns really weak and then winning them. And the more pawns I win, the more close to a draw we are. So here the natural king g7 was played to go to g6 to help these pawns, but again, the king is cut off, so we're nicely done. Knight c6 to fork the rook and pawn, and then a really nice move, rook a4 was played here. And this is a psychological moment I greatly fail at for the 2nd game in a row in this tournament. In round 1, you saw me pawn grab twice in the same game, and both pawn grabs were bad. This is a common flaw I've observed in my game. I don't know how this is a flaw, but at least I have a firm grip on it that pawn grabbing is maybe not for me, and I have to really double check my moves before I take a pawn here, which is the case in this game. Instead of taking on d4, I just have knight e7. Okay, this pawn is going nowhere, I would just always take, but really I'm trying to play knight f5 check to bring my rook in to defend against these pawns from the back and get greater chances of drawing this. Instead, I take here on d4. And this is a super severe pin that restricts, freezes 2 of my 3 pieces on the board. The opponent goes with h4, and this pawn is getting a little bit out of my hand. It's really close to being a dangerous pawn. Let's say on h3, it's a very dangerous pawn. I go king e5 here, trying to get out of the pin and trying to just go with knight f5. That's like the best way to draw this, right? As long as this king is cut, I'm doing good. This is a huge mistake. I overestimated the fact that black has just f6 here. And from many ways, this is a really good move for black. Okay, for tactical reasons, I can't take because of rook takes d4, and then black is just winning a piece. But also, this cuts my rook's presence on the king that was so important, and then just lets the king fly and help its pawns. Really, really bad. Instead, king e3 is a complete draw with the same idea. It's with knight f5 and continuously cutting the king. After f6 and the king wants to go to g6, knight f5 check, king g6, and we just check the king while still having a firm grip on f6. The second the king goes away, we just take the pawn, and if the king stays, we just have like knight f5 things, and ultimately these pawns are pretty stuck out, right? If g4, we take this, and on knight f5, let's say h3, we just, I would say bring my king here. So king f3, or just like, oh wait, king f3 loses a knight. So here I would have to play check, king here, check, king here. It's still complicated, but it's very close to a draw after there are no tactics on my knight here. So I missed this, I play king e5, allowing f6, and now I have to go back into the pin with just so sour. It's kind of forced. My king on d5 is too far from this h-pawn. And so after h3, I have to really play accurately here, and the best move again was king e3 with the best attempt possible. I tried to defend with a rook though, with rook b3. And here after g4, rook g3, I missed this beautiful move, f5 check. And I can't take the f5 pawn because of rook takes. And once I go up or down, rook takes d4 is a beautiful move. And my rook here is useless against these three pawns. If I take this rook, there's just this super beautiful h2. And I can't defend with rook h3 or rook g1. This pawn is promoting on the next move. And so I played rook a3, and after h2, forcing my rook to h1. Yes, the rook is hanging, but that pawn was gonna queen. Now rook a4, and there's nothing that can stop g3, g2, and if you take this rook, it is completely winning for black. In this position, it was heartbreaking because the initial endgame there with the knight against 4 pawns is completely drawn, but I made it complicated for myself, made a useless pawn grab, and ultimately that cost me the game, a few minor mistakes in a row. What was a draw was actually a loss, and that crushed my heart. But this is where chess challenges your mindset. In a journey of which you have such long eyes, you must be able to look at what is preventing you from going farther in your journey. And these little pawn grabs, these little moves that are not well thought out, but just badly intuitively played, are costing me games. And I learned from that in round 3 with an incredible game. And that's what I'm looking at. A bounce back from these 2 miserable losses and a fake win in round 2. See you in round 4, game 3 for me, coming soon. Thank you so much for watching. Have a marvelous day, and see you soon.